The afternoon heat pressed down on the forward airbase in eastern Afghanistan until even the steel of the ramp seemed to hum. Waves of distortion rippled off the tarmac, bending the outlines of parked aircraft. The air carried the dry tang of hot metal and faint whiffs of hydraulic fluid. Somewhere down the line, an auxiliary power unit whined steadily, the sound merging with the distant thud of helicopter blades from a perimeter patrol. Crew chiefs in sun-faded uniforms moved slowly from shade to shade, tools in hand. The pace dictated not by urgency, but by the weight of the sun. Captain Erin stood beside her F-16C, visor up, her hairline damp beneath the edge of her helmet. The folded paper checklist in her hand had the corners curled and faint oil smudges where her thumb always rested. She moved through the pre-flight like a ritual checking control surfaces, running fingers along the panel seams, confirming readings without hurrying. Other pilots in the squadron joked about her pace. A flight lead passing by offered a half smile and a shake of the head. Still running it twice. Valkyrie. She returned a neutral smile, keeping her eyes on the inspection. She had learned long ago that she preferred quiet precision to fast applause. From the open flap of the pilot tent came bursts of laughter, the easy camaraderie of those waiting their turn in the air. Hayes stepped inside briefly to confirm her sortie slot. The tent was cooler, but louder, the walls fluttering with each gust through the air conditioner. Ducked. She nodded to a few faces, received a couple of absent waves, and was already moving out before the conversation at the card table picked up again without her. Back at the jet, she slid into the seat, harness clicking into place, the canopy still open to the glare. The HUD flickered once, a faint glitch she had noticed in past flights. It was tied to the fuel gauge readout, just a momentary dip before stabilizing. She made a mental note, but didn't call it in. The mechanic had shrugged it off last week as nothing to worry about. She glanced at the gauge again, and then at the folded checklist tucked into the side pocket. As she began engine start, she felt the familiar settling of her mind. She whispered under her breath, "One more pass." The quiet mantra she had carried since flight school. It was not about combat today, just a reminder to finish every circuit, every pattern. With the same precision as the first, she knew the squadron saw her as careful, maybe overly so. But she accepted that. Precision was the measure she trusted. In the glare of the Afghan afternoon, with the ramp shimmering ahead, she prepared for another routine flight, knowing routines had a way of breaking. Midway through her training run, with the F-16 sliding along the spine of a ridgeline, Captain Erin glanced at the HUD. The grid markers for the exercise were steady, the course clean. The mountains rolled away beneath her, sharp-edged and brown under the haze, their shadows cutting deep into narrow valleys. The sun made the canopy hot against her shoulder, and the steady drone of the engine filled the space between her breaths. She was about to turn toward the final waypoint when the headset cracked alive. "Valkyrie, AWACS, be advised. Real-world tasking. CH-47, Chinook down, narrow valley, grid incoming, daylight, heavy small arms and RPG fire." The voice was urgent but kept its composure, the kind that left no doubt this was not a drill. She reached for her kneeboard, pencil ready as the coordinates rattled off. The fuel gauge flickered as she banked, the same brief dip she had noticed on the ground. She wrote the numbers fast, circling them twice, no other air cover in range. AWACS continued. "You're closest. Fuel status." She glanced again. Mid-level reserves. Enough for the run, but not for lingering. She keyed the mic. "Copy. Valkyrie en route." The HUD shifted as she toggled from training overlays to combat mode, the soft green giving way to sharper targeting symbology. The valley markers populated in the corner, and a red diamond blinked where the Chinook sat exposed. The stick felt heavier as she rolled into the new heading, mountains rising on either side. She adjusted trim, brought up the weapons page, and opened the throttle. Static hissed briefly before AWACS came back with a warning about known enemy positions. But her focus had already narrowed. She tapped the checklist pocket, feeling the folded paper through her glove, and steadied her breathing. One more pass, she murmured without thinking, not yet knowing it would become her anchor for the hours ahead. The phrase was just there, as natural as checking her speed or altitude. The fuel gauge steadied again, the flicker gone. She pushed the jet into the climb toward the first ridge, the sunlight flashing across the canopy. Training was over. The mission had found her. The first glimpse of the valley came as she crested a ridgeline. The jet angled just enough to keep lift without bleeding too much speed. The terrain dropped away sharply, revealing a narrow cut between jagged rock spines. Thin strips of scrub clung to the slopes, pale green against the brown dust. Heat shimmer rose from every surface, blurring edges until ridges wavered and shifted in the glass of her canopy. Hayes's eyes moved between the HUD and the naked terrain, looking for the flash of movement that marked a firing position. The Chinook was easy to spot. Its dark bulk lay tilted on the valley floor, rotor blades drooping, the rear ramp half open. Figures moved in and out of shadow, ducking behind the fuselage as dirt kicked up around them. A sharp trail of white smoke lanced upward from the left slope, curling as it arced. RPG launch. She banked hard, the G's settling into her ribs, and rolled the crosshair toward the origin point. The HUD wavered in the mirage, the green symbols bending slightly before snapping back. She eased in corrections, firing a short burst from the M61 cannon. The rounds hit the slope high, showering rock and dust over the position. Over the radio, the downed crew's voice cut through, strained, clipped, taking fire from both ridges. Request suppression. She made a wide turn, the wings catching a shimmer of light that reflected the valley floor and the canopy glass. Her second pass brought her closer, the ridgeline now rushing past at treetop height. Another controlled burst sent dust plumes into the air, echoing against the rock walls. The ricochets sharp and metallic. In the reflection, she caught the brief tumble of empty shell casings spinning away, flashing gold before disappearing into the shadow below. The enemy positions were well-chosen angles that could cut into the Chinook without exposing more than a helmet or shoulder. Hayes mapped them in her head, marking where suppression would cover the crew's movement and where she'd have to be careful not to rake friendly positions. She leveled out and climbed just enough to reset her run. Her breathing slowed as she lined up again. The HUD crosshair trembled slightly in the heat distortion, and she made the smallest stick correction to steady it. One more pass, she whispered, the words barely audible under the engine's steady roar. It was not a promise to end it, but the start of a rhythm she knew she would keep. Precision here meant trusting instinct as much as the glass in front of her, each shot needing to hit where sight alone might fail. Hayes brought the jet around wide, keeping her nose off the friendlies until she could drop in from an angle that cleared the Chinook entirely. The altered approach meant skimming the right ridgeline so closely she could see the lighter shade of dust where wind had scoured the rock. Turbulence hit her hard in the pocket of air along the slope, a sharp jolt that pushed her left wing toward the rock before she countered with a firm stick input. The G's pressed her into the seat as she leveled out, the cannon already armed. A short burst stitched across the ridge, and the figure that had been firing from behind a stone outcrop vanished from view. Dust settled over the spot like a curtain dropping. She rolled to reset the run when the radio crackled into static. The downed crew's voice had been coming through in short, clipped bursts, but now it was gone. She tried AWACS, got only a faint hiss. The silence carried its own weight. Without an update, she had to assume the worst, that the enemy was repositioning for a decisive hit on the Chinook before the Black Hawk could arrive. The heat shimmer deepened as the day wore on, making the valley floor swim in her HUD. Target outlines bent and quivered, then snapped back just in time for her to fire. She stopped relying on pure sight. Years of flying low-level runs and training, memorizing the rhythm of terrain, and the lag between visual and trigger, became her guide. Her left hand on the throttle made small, precise corrections, matching the climb and descent of the land below. Her right hand stayed light but steady on the stick, easing into each burst so the cannon fire walked naturally into position. A string of tracer fire arced upward from the far slope, bright and fast. She rolled slightly, just enough to throw off their aim without breaking her own. The tracers passed close enough to leave faint afterimages in her peripheral vision. She came around again, slower this time, to hold her aim on a partially hidden position marked by a sudden flash of sunlight off metal. The fuel gauge caught her eye as she leveled out another small dip. It was enough to register in her chest, the quiet knowledge that she was eating minutes she didn't have. AWACS's voice came back faintly, urging her to check reserves and reminding her of the Blackhawk's estimated arrival. She pressed the transmit but only said, "Engaging." It was not a lie, but it was not the answer they were looking for. Her kneeboard was smeared with pencil lines where she had adjusted the grid notes after each pass. The valley's map now looked more like a living thing than a chart circles, arrows, and X marks layered over the original print. She tightened her harness as she dropped into another run, this time pushing even lower. The wind noise shifted pitch, and she could feel the micro vibrations through the stick as the wingtips bit into denser air. The downed crew broke through the static for a moment, words chopped but urgent. She caught moving in cover before the transmission died. That was enough. She hit the ridge with a burst that drove dirt and debris into the air, cutting off any movement that could flank them. Another glance at the fuel gauge confirmed what she already knew. It was visibly lower with every pass, the needle edging toward the danger zone. She told herself one more pass again, but the words were different now. It was no longer a measured reminder to stay precise. It was a defiant push against a shrinking clock. She could feel it in her breathing, in the faint tightening of her grip. The next run came in steeper, the tracers thicker, the mirage making her target swim. She trusted her instinct and fired anyway, the cannon bursts echoing off the rock walls like hammer strikes. Survival here was no longer about counting minutes. It was about claiming seconds and using them well. Haze rode the turn hard, the valley walls flashing past in alternating light and shadow. The insurgents had shifted, no longer content to hold their original positions. She spotted two muzzle flashes from the opposite slope, angled to rake across the Chinook's exposed side. Her crosshair swept over them, and she sent a controlled burst downrange. The dust and rock spray obscured them for a heartbeat, enough to make them shift again. Every time she cleared one threat, another seemed to sprout from a new angle. She dipped lower, the terrain filling her canopy until it felt like she was threading a blade through the valley floor. At this altitude, the scrub and scattered rock outcroppings were sharply defined. Shadows from the jagged ridges stretched across the open ground where the Chinook sat like a wounded animal. The crew inside moved fast when they could, crawling between patches of cover as fire cracked overhead. She saw the pale trails of fresh RPG smoke curling from the far slope and immediately banked toward it. The G's pressed her into the seat, her right hand feathering the stick just enough to line up the shot without overshooting. She fired in the last seconds before crossing over the launch site, the cannon's thud reverberating in the enclosed valley. The HUD flashed a momentary warning tone as ground fire impacted near the right intake. The jet shuddered, a vibration she could feel through the stick and pedals. She checked instruments, no immediate failure, but the burn mark was visible in the corner of her canopy reflection when she leveled out. As she climbed for another run, the Black Hawk appeared on the horizon, a dark speck growing against the washed-out sky. The sight should have been relief, but it was still minutes away. The crew in that valley would have to move under fire to get aboard, and that meant she could not afford to leave a single firing position untouched. Her kneeboard map was already a mess of smudged pencil marks and hastily drawn arrows, but she didn't need to look at it anymore. The valley was memorized. She rolled in again, this time angling her pass to catch a fighter shifting between boulders near the Chinook's ramp. The movement was barely more than a flicker through the mirage, but instinct put her bursts dead on the path. She saw the figure drop out of sight, then immediately spotted another muzzle flash higher up. There was no pause. She yanked the jet into a climbing turn and came around again. Her breathing had fallen into the same rhythm as her attack runs. Each time she told herself one more pass, but each time something pulled her back in. It wasn't stubbornness alone. It was the knowledge that the people on the ground were counting on the window she was carving out for them. The phrase had stopped being a reminder of precision and had become a silent agreement, an unspoken contract between her and the rescue team still inbound. She stole another glance at the incoming Blackhawk. In the glass of her canopy, the faint shimmer of its rotor blades looked like a second set of wings hovering behind her. It was close now, the sun catching on its nose and flashing briefly. She could almost hear the chop of its rotors over the steady roar of her own engine. But she didn't let herself imagine the sound for long. There was still work to do. The next pass was the lowest yet. The ridgeline was close enough that the wingtip felt like it might scrape the stone. Her helmet pressed into the seat from the tight bank as she brought the crosshair down on another firing point. She squeezed the trigger, watched the dust rise, and climbed sharply to avoid the valley wall. The Blackhawk was descending now, preparing to make its own sprint in. She lined up for one more pass, the words silent on her lips but fixed in her mind. She would hold the line until the last possible second, not because she had to, but because loyalty demanded it. The fuel gauge needle trembled just above empty, each shallow dip a reminder that she had minutes at best before crossing the point of no return. In her headset, AWAC's voice cut through the static with clipped urgency, ordering her to break off and return to base immediately. She acknowledged the transmission with a double click on the mic, but her eyes stayed fixed on the far ridge. A thin line of dust betrayed movement. 3 insurgents slipping through a shallow cut in the slope, closing in on the Chinook's position from above. If they made it into position, the extraction would be over before it began. She dropped the nose, skimming the ridge tops so close the tops of scrub trees scraped the outer edges of her wing tanks. The sound was faint, more felt through the airframe than heard, a slight shiver that ran down into her hands on the stick. The valley walls blurred in her peripheral vision as she steadied the crosshair over the moving figures. The heat mirage bent them into wavering shadows, but instinct told her where they would be when the rounds landed. She squeezed the trigger. The cannon hammered in short, controlled bursts. Bursts that broke rock and dust around their cover and forced them flat. Pulling up was a fight in itself. The stick felt heavier, the G's pressing her into the seat, her neck straining against the weight of her helmet. As she climbed, the Blackhawk dropped into view, rotors churning the thin mountain air in a hard hover. Medics moved quickly under its spinning blades, lifting the Chinook's wounded crew toward the open cabin. The scene was a blur of movement, door gunners firing in short, raking bursts, figures hunched low, the rhythm of urgency unbroken. Then, a flash caught her attention on the far slope, a metallic blink in the sunlight, followed by the curling white thread of an RPG smoke trail. It was aimed directly at the Blackhawk, which was still low enough that any hit would be catastrophic. There was no time to think about the fuel, the warnings, or even the AWAC's order still hanging in the air. She rolled into a steep dive, the nose dropping until the horizon disappeared. The warning tones flared in her helmet, insistent and high-pitched, while the edges of her vision darkened from the G-force strain. The crosshair found the rising smoke trail just as it left the launcher. She fired, the cannon's bursts cutting into the slope and intersecting the RPG's path in midair. The projectile vanished in a scatter of fragments, pulled apart by the impact and lost in the chaos of rotor wash. The helicopter's crew didn't pause. The medics shoved the last man inside and signaled the pilot to climb. Her own climb was slower, the jet's response dulled by turbulence and the thin air at this altitude. The fuel gauge was now almost kissing the bottom mark. She ignored it. The insurgents were regrouping higher up the slope, trying to catch the Blackhawk as it gained altitude. She banked hard into another run, the words, "one more pass," forming silently in her mouth before she spoke them aloud, her voice level despite the strain. The final strafe was the lowest and closest yet. The ridgeline filled her canopy, its jagged teeth almost brushing the wingtip. She fired in a continuous burst, walking the rounds up the slope until the enemy fire broke and the figures scattered into cover. The Black Hawk cleared the ridge, banking away into open sky. Only then did she allow herself to climb out, the cockpit still flashing with fuel warnings and system alerts. She had chosen the unacceptable option, the one that ignored orders and put her own return in jeopardy, but she knew it had been the only choice that kept everyone alive. The Black Hawk lifted, its rotors pulling dust into spiraling columns as the door gunners kept up short, suppressive bursts toward the ridgeline. Hayes stayed high on the turn, watching the helicopter's dark shape climb above the valley floor, wounded secured inside. Only when it cleared the far ridge did she pull her nose up, banking toward open sky. Her left hand slid the throttle into emergency power, feeling the engine's note deepen as the F-16 climbed hard out of the heat shimmer. The fuel gauge needle hovered just above zero, trembling with each shift in pitch. She kept her eyes on the horizon, trusting the climb to carry her clear. The cockpit was suddenly quiet in a way it hadn't been for the past hour. No gunfire, no warning tones, only the steady hum of the turbine and the faint hiss of oxygen through her mask. Her breathing slowed in careful counts, easing the tightness in her chest from the last high G turns. Below, the valley shrank into a thin crease in the terrain, the Chinook still sitting like a broken shell on the floor. Combat markers on the HUD began to fade, the symbology reverting to navigation cues. She watched them shift, letting her mind follow the change in tempo. The glare off the canopy softened as she climbed above the haze, the light cooler, the air smoother. She thought about the phrase that had carried her through each run. One more pass. It lingered now, not as an order to herself but as a reminder. She would do it again if the call came, with the same precision and the same refusal to leave before the work was done. Reaching level flight, she made a final instrument sweep, noting each readout in sequence. The fuel number was still low enough to set a thread of unease in her chest, but she allowed it to settle there. Leaving the fight was no less deliberate than staying in it. Both demanded discipline. As the valley disappeared entirely behind her, she keyed the mic and reported extraction complete, her voice steady, the hum of the engine carrying her home. Heat still shimmered off the ramp as Hayes brought the F-16 to a slow taxi, the engine's whine tapering into a softer hum. She guided the jet into position, set the parking brake, and began shutting down the systems one by one. Switches clicked under her gloved fingers, the displays fading from green to black. Outside, the ground crew moved in with quiet precision, their hands tracing along the fuselage where fresh bullet scars marred the paint. One mechanic ran a palm across a scorched patch near the intake, nodding faintly to himself before stepping back. No one spoke loudly. The official paperwork would later credit Air Assets with providing cover for the extraction. Nothing more. No call signs. No pilot names. She had expected as much. A crew chief climbed the ladder, leaned into the cockpit, and without a word set a small metal piece on the glare shield, the fuel gauge component they had been meaning to replace. It was worn, the needle stuck at the edge of empty. He tapped it once with a finger, gave a short nod, and stepped away. She climbed down, helmet tucked under her arm, the ramp heat pressing up from the concrete. Inside the ready room, the air felt cooler but carried the faint smell of oil and dust. A few pilots sat scattered at tables, eyes on muted news feeds or scrolling through flight data on their tablets. Conversation was minimal, just the low hum of fans and the occasional creak of a chair. At her station, she set the helmet beside the console and cued the HUD footage. The grainy overlay showed the valley from her perspective, the slopes, the moving dust trails, the Black Hawk lifting with wounded aboard. She froze the frame where her cannon bursts, intersected the RPG smoke trail. The Black Hawk climbing clear in the background. The moment held in stillness on the screen. No caption, no fanfare. Her fingers hovered over the controls before she let the playback roll again. The phrase that had kept her in the fight was there in her mind, unspoken but present. One more pass. It was not a plan. Not yet. But if the call came, she knew what her answer would be. She reached for the helmet, the matte surface warm against her palm, and set it on the desk beside the fuel gauge part. The hum of the room filled the quiet as she leaned back, eyes on the looping footage, waiting without hurry. Some missions ended in reports and commendations. Others ended here, in the subdued rhythm of a ready room, the value measured only in the lives that made it home.